There's something people never understand about an empath until it's too late. Empaths are not weak people. They are not overly emotional people who just react to everything around them. An empath is someone who absorbs energy, studies behavior, and gives people chance after chance after chance, even when they shouldn't. That's why losing an empath is different from losing anyone else. They don't explode before they leave. They don't always argue. They don't always announce the ending. Most of the time, they disappear quietly. And when they do, it's permanent. The dangerous thing about hurting an empath is that they usually tolerate pain far longer than normal people. They keep trying to understand you. They keep trying to fix communication. They keep giving empathy to people who never deserved it in the first place. An empath will sit there and mentally replay every conversation, trying to figure out where things went wrong. They blame themselves before they blame you. That's why people mistake their patience for weakness. But every empath has a limit. The moment an empath realizes they are being emotionally drained instead of emotionally valued, something changes inside them. Not loudly, quietly. That's what makes it so dangerous. While you think everything is normal, they are already emotionally packing their bags. They stop reacting the same way. They stop arguing. They stop defending themselves. They stop chasing explanations. And most people are too distracted by their own behavior to notice it happening. People misunderstand empaths because they confuse kindness with weakness. They think because an empath forgives easily, listens deeply, and keeps giving people chances, they must not have boundaries. But the truth is, empaths often endure emotional pain longer than anyone else before they finally walk away. They are not leaving because they stopped caring. They are leaving because they cared too much for too long while receiving emotional exhaustion in return. That's what people fail to understand. Empaths don't suddenly wake up one morning and decide to disappear. Their disappearance is built slowly through disappointment, disrespect, emotional neglect, and repeated betrayals that pile up over time. An empath usually enters relationships with pure intentions. They genuinely want to understand people. They want emotional connection, honesty, trust, and peace. They notice the pain in others even when nobody else sees it. That's why empaths often attract damaged people, manipulative people, and emotionally unavailable people. They naturally become healers in relationships because they believe love and understanding can change someone. But eventually, that constant emotional giving starts draining them from the inside. The dangerous thing is that empaths rarely complain in the beginning. They tolerate behavior that most people would never tolerate. They excuse red flags because they focus on potential instead of reality. They tell themselves things like, maybe they're just struggling, or maybe they didn't mean it that way. An empath always tries to see the good in people, even when people repeatedly show them darkness. That's why they stay longer than they should. But every painful interaction leaves emotional scars. Every lie chips away at their trust. Every moment of disrespect creates emotional distance. Every manipulation slowly weakens the connection. The empath may still smile, still support you, still stay beside you physically, but mentally something begins changing. They start realizing they are emotionally carrying the relationship alone. They notice they are always the one understanding others while nobody tries to understand them. That realization hurts deeply because empaths invest emotionally in ways most people never do. What people don't realize is that empaths observe everything quietly. They pay attention to energy more than words. Someone can say, I care about you. But if their actions feel cold, distant, selfish, or dishonest, the empath notices immediately. Empaths study patterns naturally. They notice tone changes, emotional inconsistency, fake apologies, and hidden intentions. They may not confront it immediately, but they feel it internally. That emotional awareness becomes exhausting when they are constantly around negativity or manipulation. Over time, the empath reaches emotional burnout. An emotional burnout in an empath looks very different from anger. Most people expect screaming, arguments, or dramatic endings when someone is done. But empaths become quieter instead. They stop reacting emotionally because they are emotionally tired. They stop explaining their pain because they realize the other person was never truly listening anyway. They stop fighting for the relationship because they finally understand effort cannot be one-sided forever. That silence is the warning sign most people ignore. People often think they'll get over it because the empath forgave them before. But what they fail to see is that empaths keep emotional records internally. Every disappointment stays stored inside them, not because they want revenge, but because emotional wounds accumulate over time. Eventually, the pain outweighs the connection. The empath begins emotionally disconnecting for self protection. Once that emotional detachment starts, the relationship is already dying. The empath stops expecting honesty, stops expecting change, stops hoping for emotional safety. They begin accepting the reality of who the person truly is instead of focusing on who they hoped they could become. That acceptance changes everything. The empath no longer feels emotionally attached to the fantasy they created in their mind. And when an empath loses emotional attachment, they become incredibly hard to reach again. This is the stage where people suddenly panic. They notice the empath no longer reacts emotionally, no longer chases communication, no longer begs for understanding. The empath becomes calm, distant, and emotionally unavailable. Ironically, this is often when the other person finally starts trying harder. But by then, it's usually too late because the empath already spent months emotionally grieving while still present in the relationship. By the time they physically leave, they already processed the loss internally. That's why their disappearance feels sudden to others, but not to them. In their mind, they already said goodbye long ago. They simply waited until their heart finally accepted what their intuition had been warning them about the entire time. And when they finally disappear, they rarely return the same way again. One of the biggest mistakes people make with empaths is believing they can continuously betray them without consequences. Because empaths are patient, forgiving, and emotionally understanding, people assume they will always stay no matter how badly they are treated. But betrayal affects an empath differently than it affects most people. An empath doesn't just hear your words or see your actions. They absorb the emotional energy behind everything you do. That's why even small acts of dishonesty can slowly destroy the trust an empath once had in you. Empaths value emotional honesty more than almost anything else. They can handle flaws, they can handle mistakes, they can even handle difficult personalities if they believe the connection is genuine. But what slowly destroys them is manipulation, emotional games, fake loyalty, and repeated dishonesty. An empath can feel when someone's energy changes. They can sense when conversations become forced, when intentions become selfish, and when someone is emotionally hiding something. Even if they don't confront it immediately, they feel the shift internally. That's why betrayal cuts so deeply for an empath. It's not just the action itself, it's the realization that someone they trusted emotionally was willing to damage the connection for selfish reasons. And because empaths invest emotionally at such a deep level, betrayal feels personal to their soul. They replay conversations in their mind. They overanalyze situations. They question themselves endlessly, trying to understand why someone they cared for would hurt them. The tragic part is that empaths often stay after the first betrayal. They give second chances because they understand human imperfection. They convince themselves people can change. They believe honesty and communication can repair emotional damage. That's why toxic people often become comfortable around empaths. They realize the empath keeps forgiving behavior that should never have been tolerated in the first place. But forgiveness does not erase emotional damage. Every betrayal leaves a mark. Every broken promise creates emotional distance. Every manipulation weakens the empath's ability to trust again. Over time, the empath begins carrying emotional exhaustion that nobody notices. On the outside, they may still act normal, still care, still communicate, but internally, their heart becomes heavier and more guarded. The dangerous thing is that empaths rarely become cold immediately. Instead, they become quieter. They start emotionally observing instead of emotionally participating. They notice patterns more clearly. They stop believing words and begin trusting energy instead. This is where relationships with empaths begin collapsing silently. Most people completely miss this stage. They think because the empath hasn't left yet, everything must still be repairable. But what they fail to realize is that the empath is slowly detaching emotionally for survival. Betrayal forces an empath to choose between protecting their peace or continuing to sacrifice themselves for someone who keeps keeps hurting them. Eventually, even the most loving empath becomes emotionally exhausted. And once exhaustion replaces hope, the relationship changes permanently. An empath who has been betrayed too many times stops opening their heart fully. They stop sharing their deepest emotions because vulnerability no longer feels safe. They stop expecting loyalty because disappointment has become predictable. This emotional withdrawal often confuses the other person because the empath doesn't always announce what's happening. They simply stop investing energy the same way they used to. The connection begins dying quietly. What makes this even more painful is that empaths usually blame themselves before blaming others. They wonder if they cared too much, trusted too much, gave too much. They question whether they ignored obvious warning signs because they wanted the relationship to work so badly. That internal emotional battle drains them mentally and emotionally for long periods of time. But eventually, clarity arrives. The empath finally realizes that love without respect becomes self-destruction. They understand that constantly forgiving betrayal teaches people they can continue hurting them without consequences. That realization becomes a turning point. The empath stops trying to save people who are comfortable destroying emotional trust. And when an empath reaches that point, something terrifying happens. They emotionally disappear. Not through revenge, not through screaming, not through hate, through silence, through emotional absence, through complete detachment. They stop chasing explanations because they no longer need closure from someone who repeatedly disrespected their heart. They stop trying to prove their value because they understand real loyalty never requires begging. By the time the other person realizes the empath has emotionally checked out, it's usually too late. The empath already spent countless nights processing the pain internally. They already mourned the relationship while still physically present. That's why their final goodbye feels so calm and cold compared to the depth of love they once showed. Because once an empath realizes someone repeatedly betrayed their trust, they stop seeing that person as emotionally safe forever. One of the clearest signs that an empath is preparing to leave forever is when they stop explaining their pain. Most people completely misunderstand this stage because they think silence means the empath no longer cares. In reality, silence often means the empath cared too much for too long and finally became emotionally exhausted. Empaths are naturally communicators when they love someone deeply. They try to fix misunderstandings. They try to create emotional clarity. They explain their feelings repeatedly because they genuinely want peace, connection, and understanding. That's why when an empath suddenly becomes quiet, something serious has already changed internally. At the beginning of emotional pain, an empath usually speaks openly. They tell you what hurts them. They explain what feels wrong. They try to solve problems through communication because they believe emotional honesty can heal relationships. Even after being disappointed, they continue giving chances because they focus on emotional potential rather than emotional reality. They keep hoping the other person will finally understand their heart. But the problem begins when the empath realizes their words are no longer changing anything. They notice the same toxic patterns repeating, the same disrespect, the same emotional neglect, the same excuses after every painful situation. Over time, the empath begins feeling emotionally unheard. And for someone who values emotional depth more than surface level connection, that feeling becomes unbearable. The dangerous thing about emotional exhaustion is that it happens slowly. The empath does not wake up one day completely detached. It happens piece by piece. Every ignored feeling drains them a little more. Every time their emotions are dismissed, they lose a little more trust. Every fake apology weakens the emotional bond further. Eventually, they begin realizing they are fighting for a relationship that the other person is barely protecting. That realization changes an empath deeply. At first, they may still attempt communication, but their energy becomes different. Their voice becomes calmer. Their reactions become smaller. They stop begging to be understood because they start accepting that true understanding cannot be forced. This is the phase where most people make a huge mistake. They mistake the empath's silence for acceptance. They think maybe they're finally over it, or maybe things are okay again. But internally, the empath is already withdrawing emotionally. See, when an empath stops explaining their pain, it's because they no longer believe their vulnerability is emotionally safe with you. That is one of the most painful conclusions an empath can reach about someone they once loved deeply. They begin protecting their emotions instead of sharing them openly. They stop revealing what hurts because experience has taught them their feelings will either be ignored, minimized, or used against them later. And once an empath reaches that emotional state, the relationship enters dangerous territory. The empath starts emotionally grieving while still physically present. They begin imagining life without the connection. They slowly stop depending on the relationship emotionally. Their heart becomes quieter, not because they stop loving completely, but because love without emotional safety eventually becomes emotional suffering. Most people never notice this process happening because empaths often continue acting kind even while emotionally detaching. They still care, still support, still remain respectful, but internally, they are no longer emotionally invested. Same way, they stop planning a future around the relationship because trust no longer feels stable enough to hold their heart safely. And the more emotionally detached they become, the less energy they waste trying to explain themselves. That's the final warning sign. An empath who once wrote long emotional messages now responds with short answers. An empath who once fought for connection now chooses silence over arguments. An empath who once cried trying to save the relationship suddenly appears emotionally calm. But that calmness is not peace inside the relationship. It's acceptance that the relationship may already be over emotionally. This stage confuses people because the empath no longer reacts dramatically. There's no screaming, no emotional chaos, no just distance. Quiet distance. And ironically, this is often when the other person finally starts realizing the empath is slipping away. But by then, the empath has already spent weeks or months processing emotional pain internally. They already replayed the conversations in their mind, already questioned themselves endlessly, already tried to understand the other person's behavior from every angle possible. And after exhausting themselves emotionally, they finally reached a painful conclusion. No amount of explaining can fix someone who refuses to truly listen. That realization changes everything. The empath stops trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding them. They stop over-explaining their feelings because they realize emotional maturity cannot be forced onto another person. Instead, they begin protecting their peace quietly. And when an empath begins choosing peace over attachment, their disappearance is usually not far away, because once they stop explaining their pain, they are no longer fighting for the connection the way they once did. Internally, they are already preparing themselves to let go of the person they never wanted to lose in the first place. When an empath emotionally disconnects from someone, it rarely happens impulsively. People imagine that empaths leave because they suddenly stop caring, but the truth is far more painful than that. An empath usually disconnects after trying everything possible to save the relationship first. They communicate, they forgive, they tolerate emotional pain longer than they should. They keep hoping the connection will return to what it once was. But eventually, there comes a moment where the empath realizes they are destroying themselves emotionally by continuing to stay attached to someone who repeatedly drains their energy. That realization changes an empath permanently. Most people don't understand how deeply empaths attach emotionally. When they love someone, they invest their heart fully. They pay attention to little details. They remember emotional moments. They genuinely care about the happiness and well-being of the people close to them. That's why emotional betrayal affects them so strongly. It doesn't just hurt their feelings. It damages their sense of emotional safety. And once emotional safety disappears, the empath begins slowly shutting down internally. At first, they may still try to hold the relationship together. They may continue being patient, even while hurting deeply inside. But over time, the emotional imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. The empath notices they are constantly giving understanding while receiving confusion in return. They notice they are always emotionally available for someone who disappears whenever accountability is needed. That emotional imbalance slowly turns love into exhaustion. The frightening part is that emotional disconnection in an empath often happens silently. There's no dramatic announcement, no loud final warning. The empath simply starts withdrawing emotionally piece by piece. They become less expressive, less emotionally reactive, less vulnerable. They stop sharing parts of themselves because they no longer trust them relationship enough to expose their heart completely. Most people fail to notice this shift because the empath still appears calm on the surface, but internally they are preparing themselves to let go. See, empaths are naturally loyal people. They don't give up easily. That's why when they finally emotionally disconnect, it usually means they have reached a level of pain they can no longer tolerate. They already spent countless nights thinking about the relationship, already replayed every conversation in their head, already questioned themselves repeatedly trying to understand where things went wrong. And after all that emotional processing, they finally arrive at a painful conclusion. Love alone cannot heal constant emotional damage. That's the moment the disconnect becomes permanent. An empath who once chased connection suddenly begins chasing peace instead. They realize protecting their emotional energy matters more than holding on to unhealthy attachment. This shift shocks people because the empath no longer reacts the way they used to. The person who once fought for every misunderstanding suddenly becomes emotionally distant and calm. But that calmness is dangerous because when an empath becomes emotionally calm after repeated pain, it often means they are done internally. They no longer expect change, no longer expect honesty, no longer expect emotional consistency. Their hope has faded. And when hope disappears from an empath's heart, the emotional bond weakens rapidly. This is usually when the other person finally notices something is wrong. They sense the empath pulling away emotionally. Conversations feel colder. The emotional warmth is gone. The empath no longer seeks closeness with the same intensity. And suddenly the person who ignored the empath's feelings starts panicking. But by then, the empath has already emotionally detached. That's the painful irony of losing an empath. People often appreciate their value only after them. Emotional connection is already broken. They realize too late how rare genuine empathy actually is. They miss the emotional support, the understanding, the loyalty, the deep connection they once took for granted. But empaths rarely reconnect fully after emotional detachment reaches its final stage. Because once an empath disconnects, they remember why they had to. They remember the emotional exhaustion, the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, the feeling of being emotionally unheard. And even if they still care deep down, they understand returning to the same unhealthy dynamic would only reopen wounds they struggled to heal. That's why an empath's disappearance feels so permanent. They are not leaving impulsively. They are leaving after surviving emotional pain for far too long. By the time they finally walk away, they already carried the emotional weight of the ending internally for months. Their heart became tired before their body ever left. And once an empath finally chooses peace over emotional attachment, they rarely turn back completely. Not because they stopped loving, but because they finally learned that loving someone should never require abandoning themselves in the process.